Welcome to this special event marking the 100th anniversary to the day of the death of Michael Moran, who was shot on the campus of NUI Galway. Thank you to John Cunningham, lecturer in history at NUI Galway, for organizing this event and for chairing it tonight. My name is Daniel Carey, and I'm director of the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. I'm very glad for us to be hosting the event, and I want to thank you for joining us. 91 people have signed up for tonight's event. As ever, David Kelly, Digital Humanities Manager in the Moore Institute, is running the show behind the scenes. Thank you, David. John, over to you.
Well, as Dan said, I'm John Cunningham, and I'll be asking the questions this evening. And my thanks to David also, and indeed to Dan for setting this up. Now, as you all know, the seminar marks the centenary of a terrible event, one of many terrible events that took place in Ireland in November 1920. We're focusing on one of these, but we'll also be looking at some of the wider context. Michael Moran was in Galway against his will, and he was only briefly on the university campus, but it was there that he lost his life. The university wished to mark the centenary of his death, thus this seminar, and it is intended also that a permanent memorial will be put in place in the near future. Before going over to our panelists, I'll say a few introductory words myself about Galway. When Michael Moran was taken here in 1920, the city, or more properly the town, was a much smaller place with a population of about 13 or 14,000, 1/6 of its present size. And there were military and militarized police around every corner. There were black and tans in the RIC barracks in Eglinton Street, Dominic Street, the docks in Salt Hill. You had auxiliaries in Taylor's Hill and Salt Hill, army regiments in Redmore Barracks, in the workhouse, which is where the university hospital now stands, and in Earl's Island, which is now the university's O'Donoghue Centre for Drama and Theatre Studies. The university was likewise a much smaller place with little over 200 students. Many of them were playing a part in the struggle for Irish independence. There was a university corps of the Irish Volunteers, which had been active for several years before 1920, and students had been notably active in the 1918 general election campaign. Just 2 weeks before the killing of Michael Moran on 11th of November 1920, the conflict came onto the campus when a detachment of soldiers halted lectures and obliged students to come outside to observe the 2-minute silence in memory of the war dead. And those who didn't comply were arrested. So I won't go into any further detail than that, and I'll go straight to introducing our panelists, and I'll do that in alphabetical order. Síobhra Aiken is a researcher at the Centre for Irish Studies here at NUI Galway. She was joint editor of a book, The Men Will Talk to Me, Ernie O'Malley's interviews with the Northern Divisions, which was published 2 years ago. Also, she's written a number of articles on trauma, gender, and immigration during the Irish Revolution. Síobhra, I should say, recently submitted her doctoral dissertation entitled Ridding Ourselves of the Past, Trauma, Testimony, and the Irish Civil War. And I'm sure we're looking forward to seeing that in book form in the next year or two. Professor Linda Connolly is a distinguished writer on women's history. She's director of the Social Science Institute at NUI Maynooth, and this is a big week for her because her book, Women and the Irish Revolution, Feminism, Activism, Violence, has just been published, and I think the postman arrived with it at Linda's house, and indeed at many other houses this morning. We'll talk a bit about that later on. Dr. Jarlath Deignan is a member of the Old Tuam Society and a regular contributor to the Society's annual journal. He has a special interest in the revolutionary decade and is the author of Troubled Times, War and Rebellion in North Galway, 1913 to 23. He's a graduate of NUI Galway and he works as a GP in Tuam. Damian Quinn is also a graduate of NUI Galway with a BA and an M.Lit in history. He's a military historian with an interest in the revolutionary decade, and he's organised commemorative events and has recently begun publishing on the period. It was Damian who drew our attention to the Michael Moran centenary. And just about a week or so ago, we recorded Damian in daylight on the site of the killing of Michael Moran, and I have to thank Mary Cunningham who filmed this and then edited it. So if we can go over to look at this short clip, please, David.
On the night of the 24th of November 1920, Commanding Officer of the Tuam Brigade IRA, Michael Moran, was escorted to this site here, NUIG, just outside the engineering building. Michael Moran had been arrested in October, and he had been arrested and he'd been brought to the jail, which is behind here now, the site of the cathedral, in early October. He spent 6 weeks there. On release, he was re-arrested and brought to Eglinton Street station, where the RIC main barracks was. He spent a further 2 days there, and on the evening of the 24th, he was escorted by 3 auxiliary officers from Eglinton Street to be brought to here where the Lancers, the 17 Lancers were stationed, and some black and tans. So John, here we are on the site of the old handball alley. The back wall was here behind me, across from the engineering building. The 2 sides went that way. And as you can see, the Earl's Island is just over there. The O'Donoghue Centre, where the Lancers were stationed, and the black and tans. So the proximity, the relationship between his body, the handball alley, and the camp is paramount.
Right, thank you. Thanks for that, David, and thanks indeed to Damian. So I think we get a sense of the location, indeed, those of us who know the university campus. I'm just going to move on now straight away into the discussion. And I'd start with a question to Linda, really to set this in context, the general situation, I suppose, in the closing months of 1920. Perhaps you could talk to us about that for a minute.
Sure. Well, just to say, as we know, the Irish War of Independence, or also called the Anglo-Irish War, occurred between 1919 to 1921, and the British Army, along with the quasi-military RIC and its other forces, the Auxiliaries and the Ulster Special Constabulary. And really, I suppose, in the broader context, both that earlier period and the later, which we'll talk about in a second, was what we might call an escalation of the Irish revolutionary period into warfare. So if we can imagine the whole period of revolution, this is the, I suppose, stage in which we see the more kind of severe forms of conflict emerging and reaching their heights. And I think this event that we're discussing this evening can be put in that context. I suppose the peak of the violence was really between 1920 and July 1921 in particular. And I suppose the conflict in Ireland, if we compare it to other kinds of wars, can be described or characterized by what we might call a lethal guerrilla campaign. Again, obviously with the IRA, but also 2 auxiliary police units, the Black and Tans, which were 7,000 strong, and who were mainly ex-British soldiers demobilized after World War I. And they were deployed in March 1920 and gained a reputation both for drunkenness, to draw on Louise Ryan's article, Drunken Tans, but also for poor discipline. So if you can imagine this combination of what might be called lethal guerrilla violence, which was mobilised by the IRA, and this kind of force, if you like, brought in with a reputation for poor discipline, was a very kind of powerful combination in terms of the nature and essence of the conflict in that latter period. Also in July 1920, a second quasi-military body, the Auxiliaries, were recruited into Ireland. There were less of them, but perhaps we could argue they had more of an impact. There were around 2,200 came to Ireland, and arguably they were more effective in taking on the IRA. So what we see is, as I said, this combination of military tactics on both sides, with the conflict escalating, and a policy of reprisals, which in a sense meant that this became a very, dangerous conflict in this period.
Thank you, Linda. I'll move over to Síobhra now. Hello, Síobhra.
Hi, John.
Yes. So maybe you might elaborate a little bit on the auxiliaries and the nature of the force.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'll just reflect on three things, I suppose, because this context of the auxiliaries, I think, is important to set us up for what we'll be talking about later on in a broader scheme of things. So I'll just reflect briefly on who exactly were the auxiliaries that Linda has just mentioned. How did they differ from the Black and Tans, and what was both their purpose and their modus operandi? And I suppose one of the first things to mention is, within this context, when we have this escalation of guerrilla warfare, the British authorities did not see the IRA initially, or Cunningham, as legitimate military forces. And as a result, they really relied on the IRC to attempt to suppress the rebels. But as the warfare escalated, the IRC, the police force, increasingly became under pressure. And we see that in their own accounts and their memoirs, that there's a real sense of them being isolated and ostracized from their community. And as a result, then we have two cohorts who are recruited in order to aid the RIC in policing. And Linda mentioned the first cohort there, which were the Black and Tans. I'll reflect a little bit about that second cohort that came in July 1920, and they were the auxiliaries. A lot of the time in popular memory, we confuse the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. However, they're quite different in how they operated. The auxiliaries worked independently from the RIC. They were also paid twice as much as a regular police officer. These were ex-officers from the British Army. They'd been decorated, and they had been recognised for their military prowess, I suppose, mostly in the First World War, but also in international wars. So about 2,000 arrived in Ireland from the end of the summer in 1920. And I suppose we can say that they were accustomed to giving orders and not receiving orders. And so that leads to this reputation that they earn for flouting military law and for their eagerness perhaps to terrorise the local population. And there's even fascinating accounts from within the auxiliaries of this unease around this sense of disorder. And there's a brilliant memoir by General F.P. Crozier, who actually resigned in disgust of the way in which protection was being afforded to these unruly officers. And that memoir is called The Men I Killed. It's actually available on Kindle, but it's a really fascinating account just to get a perspective of an auxiliary officer in Ireland at this time. And so just to wrap up then, leading into what we'll be looking at in more detail, there's been an emphasis, I think, in some scholarship on how these officers might have been I suppose, influenced by their wartime experiences, whether they were suffering PTSD, whether this affected their everyday violence. We also have to remember that, however, that they were trained and conditioned as soldiers, that this was part of what they had been trained to do as members of the British authorities, of the British military. And the authorities themselves were happy in some ways to endorse a policy of assassinations and reprisals. And this really is apparent in Galway. There was actually a sanctioned policy from December 1920 of reprisals in the British military. So whether this policy of reprisals was sanctioned or not, it led to a number of cases in Galway, which we'll be reflecting on in the next few papers.
Thanks, Síobhra, for that contextualisation. I suppose it's time we spoke about Michael Moran himself. So I'm just going to go over to Jarlath now. Jarlath, who was Michael Moran?
Thanks, John. Well, Michael Moran was the son of Patrick and Margaret Moran from Carramoneen outside Tuam. His father was a farmer, and the family lived about 2 miles from the town on the Mount Bellew Road. Michael was born in 1891, and he was the eldest of 5 children. He had 3 younger sisters and a younger brother. We don't know an awful lot about his early life, but we do know that his father died in 1915, and when Michael, at the age of 24, then took over responsibility for looking after the family farm with his widowed mother. Like many of his generation, he was no doubt influenced by the events of 1916, because we read in the Bureau of Military History that he became the chief organizer of both the Volunteers and Sinn Féin in the Barnajarig region during the years 1917 and 1918. This was the time where we saw a change in the political tide in Ireland, the growth of Sinn Féin and the reorganisation of volunteer companies. And at this time in Barnajarig, his role would be really to organise simple drill, foot drill with the men, the other volunteers, twice a week. They had very little, if any, ammunition, perhaps some shotguns and perhaps 1 rifle. He is described by his colleagues at the time as being a man of fine physique, somebody with strong aspirations and somebody who was fearless in nature. And no doubt these leadership qualities became apparent to others in the volunteers, because around the year 1919, he was appointed commandant of the Tuam Battalion. Now, the Tuam Battalion at this time consisted of 10 companies, including Tuam Town, his own company in Barnajarig, and other villages around, such as Connolly, Cortoon and Milltown. So by this time in 1919, he was the leading volunteer IRA officer in the Tuam region.
Okay, yeah. So maybe can you continue for a few more minutes and tell us about the developments in the Tuam area and Michael Moran's involvement in them?
Yeah, well, as Linda has said earlier, there wasn't a huge amount of activity in 1919 from a military perspective, but this was all to change in 1920. And at the very start of 1920, Michael Moran organised 2 attacks on rural RIC barracks. One at Castle Hackett, which was a rural barracks between Belclare and Carlistran in January 1920, and another at Castlegrove near Kilconnolly at the end of March 1920. Now, both of those attacks involved large numbers of volunteers arriving in the middle of the night and attacking the barracks unaware. Most of them arrived with shotguns. As I say, there was very few rifles at the time. But we also saw in both attacks the use of gelignite by the volunteers. And here there's another connection with the college by the fact that Michael Moran had a friendship with another volunteer called Michael Walsh from Ceylon, who was an engineering student at UCG. And he came home every weekend and taught other volunteer officers in the region how to make explosives. So in both attacks, the RIC defended their barracks. The gelignite failed to blow holes in the gables to allow entrance, but the attacks were successful by the very fact that the barracks were evacuated in the days following the attacks. And so the IRA had attained nominal control of the rural areas around them. He was also involved in the destruction of these vacated barracks in the subsequent weeks and months, particularly in Easter Saturday night 1920, the 4th anniversary of the Easter Rising. There were numerous barracks that were destroyed, vacated barracks, and Michael Moran himself was involved in the destruction of the barracks in Barnajarig. We also know that he organised other activities, including procuring arms, and at that time he and others collected somewhere in the region of £600, a huge amount of money, to be brought to GHQ in Dublin to get rifles secretly sent down to Tuam. He was also involved in organising his men to raid mail cars to look for correspondence to Crown forces, and also directing his men to obstruct jurors from attending British courts. But the most significant event to occur in North Galway at this time, and involving Michael Moran, was an ambush that occurred outside Tuam on the evening of Monday, the 19th of July, 1920. Now, this ambush occurred in the townland of Gala, which is about 3 miles from Tuam on the Tuam to Dunmore Road. The ambush occurred at about 8 p.m. On the evening, and Michael Moran organised the attack with Con Fogarty, who was the newly appointed commandant of the North Galway Brigade. The ambush involved about 20 volunteers from 3 companies, Tuam, Barnajarrig and Cortoon, and the men planned to ambush a police car, bringing 4 policemen back to Dunmore from Tuam that evening. Essentially, at a bend on the road, they put down a large tree to force the police car to stop. The volunteers themselves were located on one side of the road on elevated ground behind bushes. 2 of the policemen got out to remove the tree trunk, and at that stage there was an exchange of gunfire between the volunteers and the policemen. As a result of the attack, 2 of the policemen, James Burke and Patrick Carey, were shot dead. The 2 other policemen eventually surrendered. They were blindfolded and directed towards Tuam. The police car was set on fire and the volunteers escaped across the fields. Later that night, the town of Tuam was sacked in retaliation by the police, who went on a spree, including a destructive spree, including burning down the town hall, burning a large drapery store, Kenny's drapery store, and terrorising the town people. And I just want to emphasise that these were regular RIC men at this time. The Black and Tans and Auxiliaries hadn't arrived in the Tuam area at this stage. So these 2 events, the Gala ambush and the sack of Tuam that followed, made national and international news headlines for the next 2 days. The police on the night of the sack of Tuam did call out to Michael Moran's house at Caramonian and fired shots at it. And for about a week after the sack of Tuam, his volunteers in his battalion provided guard at his house because it was suspected that it would be burnt down. But there was no doubt that after the Gala ambush, Michael Moran was very much a marked man, and he would be arrested just over 2 months later and brought to Galway for questioning.
Okay, thanks. That's a very detailed, very informative account there. And yeah, and that is drawn from Jarlath's book that we mentioned at the outset, which is still available, I think, in the shops. I want to go on to go back and into the incident itself, as it were, which Damian introduced in the film. So if we have Damian there somewhere.
Hi, John.
Hello, Damian. So maybe if you could first elaborate a little bit on the incident itself, though you covered it fairly comprehensively in the time you had there in the film. But,
yeah, well, he was, from what we know, he had been released from the jail, the site of the old cathedral, and he was rearrested and brought down to Eglinton Street barracks, the main RIC barrack in the town. And then he was kept for a couple more days, and then they were bringing him up to Earl's Island to the Lancers. A couple of Black and Tans were stationed up there along with some other prisoners. And I mean, I've argued in my recent publication in the Advertiser that we can see that I don't think they brought him up there for any other reason but to kill him. There seems to be no doubt about that, in my personal opinion anyways. This May the 3rd, 1920, as I stated before, a circular went out to all the main military areas in the country, clearly stating in paragraph 7 that anybody who attempted to escape can be shot legally. And I think that when you look at the company and you look at the people involved in it and you look at all of the events that they were involved in Galway from the minute they arrived in September, they came here to do one thing and to take out certain people. And definitely Mr. Moran was one of them. And I don't think they were bringing him in there to detain him or to further investigate him. I think they had already established the facts that they wished, that he was a substantial player in the North Galway IRA and he was to be eliminated. These guys seem to have a law unto themselves in regardless to this. I mean, they went on, they were involved in the killing of Father Michael Griffin, Michael Walsh, Michael Moran, what's the guy's name? Lawrence McDonough out in Inishmore, Louis Darcy. I mean, it's endless. They really went for it. The area that kind of fascinates me the most is the Collins files that were kept on all the auxiliary companies. I was just looking at them again today, and they make for great reading. The D Company station in Lennaboy now, full-time at this stage, they say there were 150 auxiliaries stationed there. So that was broken down into 3 different platoons with company leaders and whatever else. And the bit that gets me is, I suppose the question I'm working off is, how did 150, predominantly English guys, right, who have arrived just into the west of Ireland, manage to find out all the information required to go after people like Michael Moran, Father Griffin, you know, the list I've just given you, Michael Walsh, so on and so forth. This was partly facilitated by local ex-servicemen who joined the Black and Tans, or Tea Cadets as they were called. Now, I won't go into names just at the moment. It's a kind of a very delicate procedure. But just on the 8th of the 12th, 1920, right? The 8th of the 12th, 1920, I have a list of 8 men from Galway who went to Renmore with a recommendation from former captains and senior members of their regiments to join up. They were predominantly all Connacht Rangers who had served in World War I and the Boer War before. These guys were invaluable to D Company because they could work with D Company and they knew their areas, the townlands where they came from. They knew who was operating in their areas. There was only one intelligent officer working with D Company, and you can see that he, by going through the files, he references the serial numbers of these 8 guys who will remain nameless for the moment. And basically, they're given information to D Company. Moran is out there. I heard he was involved in the Gaelic ambush. Let's go, you know. And this is exactly what happened. So that's where we are with it. I think that there's a lot of confusion, and Síobhra was saying, it was brilliant what you said. There's the auxiliaries, there's the Black and Tans, there's the RIC. You know, we always have this image of whom did what. But for Galway, there is no doubt that there were plenty of ex-servicemen who joined as Tea Cadets, Black and Tans, who then worked alongside D Company for the 1.5 to 2 years of the War of Independence.
Okay, thanks, Damian. So these are a number of other incidents as well that took place in Galway, which again we're commemorating the centenary of the Michael Walsh, Father Griffin, and so on over the recent past. So we've looked at the escalation in the North Galway area in Galway City. I might go over to Síobhra now to talk about the other parts of the county, South Galway. There were some notorious episodes there as well, isn't that right?
That's it, John. I'll just reflect on 2 episodes that occurred outside Girth. And I think one of the most well-remembered episodes of this period, and there was a number of violent events, but one of the most remembered is the killing of Harry and Patrick Lochnan. And they were arrested outside their family home in Shan Aglish near Girth. And I should just mention, actually, just coming back to Damian's point, that it was a mixed force of auxiliaries and RIC apparently that arrested them at their home. They were, I think, in the field threshing corn when the raiding party came to their home. That was the 26th of November 1920. And the Lochnan brothers, they were active volunteers, and there's a suggestion that they were arrested because of their role in an ambush at Castle Daly, which had taken place a number of weeks previously. And that ambush led to the death of one RIC officer, Constable Timothy Horan. And he was, I think, one of 5 police officers who were killed between July and December in 1920. And so the 2 brothers were arrested, and really days go by where the family hear nothing of them. They're wondering where they've gone to, and the mother is going to the police office looking to find any information on them. And their sister Nora is actually told that the brothers had escaped and that they had fled and that they were on the run. However, about 3 weeks later, a cousin of the brothers finds their bodies in a shallow pool of water. And there's evidence there that they were tortured. There's a suggestion that they were tied to a tailgate. Their legs and arms were broken. They were missing fingers. Their clothes had been torn off them. Not only that, they had been set alight, and grenades had been put into their mouths as well. So really quite harrowing. And I think what makes this all the most difficult maybe or more profound is the fact that there are photos of the remains of their bodies that were taken at the funeral as a means, I suppose, to prove that this was happening, and these photographs were circulated as evidence at the time. The killing of the Lochnans, that was only one reprisal following that ambush that I mentioned at Castle Daly. As well as this event, there were also a number of farmhouses in the area that were burnt down, which would have been maybe kind of typical of what we'd expect of this kind of reprisal activity. But as well as that, 2 days after the Castle Daly ambush, a woman named Eileen Quinn was shot outside her home, her family home, which was outside Girth. She was 24, she was the mother of 3, and she was heavily pregnant. She was actually carrying one of her children at the time. And she was essentially standing or sitting outside of her home, waiting for her husband to come back from the fair at Girth. And it really was a very traumatic death. She bled for hours. There were attempts to save her unborn child. And even though she was in such pain, she actually offered to give a statement to attest to what had happened and possibly identify her shooter. However, a statement was never taken from her. And I think what's interesting to reflect on as I finish here is that both cases were followed by whitewash inquiries, essentially. So in the case of Eileen Quinn, her death was attributed to misadventure. Her husband, however, was given £300 in compensation. So there is some kind of evidence or admission perhaps there of guilt on the part of the British authorities that he was given that compensation. In terms of the brothers, there was a trial or an inquiry, and their deaths were attributed to persons unknown. So there was never really any kind of conclusion to that. And I'll just finish off, I'll say, if any of you are interested in learning more about these 2 cases, there is a podcast by Orla Higgins, who is a relation of Eileen Quinn, which was done by RTE, you can get online, which is worth a listen to. And then also more recently, Conor McNamara has done a video, which is on the Galway Bio Facebook page on the Lochnan brothers.
Yeah. Thanks, Síobhra. Thank you. I just, we got a message here from one of our listeners, as it were, Deirdre Connolly, who just lets us know that the photographer of in those photographs that was mentioned there by Síobhra was Tommaso Hine from Killina, south of Kinvara, and it was in his brother's barn that the Lochnans were waked. That reminds me to announce also that people who are on our Zoom link can ask questions. They can. There's a chat function which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. So if you have a question, you can type it in to the chat function. You can also indicate that you want to ask a question live. That's up to yourself. You can join the discussion live, as it were. Those of you who are watching it on Facebook may also enter questions if they're as a comment on the Facebook page, and they'll be brought to my attention. So we just we're in the Gort area with Síobhra there, and she mentioned the Eileen Quinn killing. But that takes me back to Linda. Linda, you're an authority, I suppose, on the position of women in during this period, and the violence encountered by women in particular. The Eileen Quinn incident is a particularly odious example of what's happened. But in the context of your new book and so on, maybe you could talk us through that side of things during the conflict.
Sure. So I think, Síobhra's just getting into the whole terrain of some of the more transgressive violence that occurred in this period. And I was very interested to hear Jarlath's comments, because some of the, I suppose, issues I've been looking at have been, there has been a tendency, I suppose, to focus on men's involvement in the conflict of this period, with the assumption that perhaps women weren't as impacted, or certainly that these were very rare events of the kind around Eileen Quinn that Síobhra is describing so vividly there. But we now know that violence, women experienced violence in different ways, and a lot of new evidence has come to the fore in recent years. And what is really interesting is that even in Jarlath, what you're describing there in Tuam, I'm going to pick up on a couple of cases in a moment. There are parallels, I suppose, that both, we could say that the volunteers, the Republicans, they were quite happy for Cunningham on to be involved in the dangerous work, even the carrying of things in their bodies and the risky work at night, etc. On the other hand, there was also a culture of policing women as well. And I have a couple of examples here. You mentioned, I'm going to first of all focus on the witness statement of Michael Higgins, which is actually in Belclare as well, his witness statement. And he mentions how Brigadier Fogarty and Thomas Hussey were involved in a haircutting incident. And we know from this period that haircutting was widely used by both sides as, I suppose, both a form of reprisal, but also as a way of policing women's behaviour. And this example, there's quite a long description of this event in Michael Higgins' witness statement, but it's a very sort of really evocative and moving scene where a young girl who isn't named, but again, very typically, she had written a letter to an RIC man giving him information on volunteer activity. So you can see the intricacy of the relationships among men and women. It was captured in the mail, and it was brought to her house and read out. And a scene erupted. Her hair was cut with the shears. And we see many cases of this, throughout the country, but including in Galway. The relatives started throwing holy water. So it's quite I suppose, a powerful scene. We also see, again, other kinds of examples from the perspective of the Republican women being, I suppose, targeted in this way. Again, a good example would be the Cunningham activist Peg Broderick Nicholson in Galway, who likewise had her hair sheared or cut in this way. There is another one in the Tuam area, which I will just read out because it's a report from a newspaper. So on May 27th, a public court case in Galway involving what at the time was termed an outrage near Tuam was reported in the Westmeath Examiner on May 15th, 1920. So Bridget Keegan's hair was cut off when 7 masked men entered her father's house on April 30th. And I think what is so interesting about these kinds of attacks is both the numbers of men involved, sometimes 7, 12, 15, often masked in these kind of terrifying incidents. So members of the family testified, and 3 brothers, Jack, Frank, and William Jordan, were sentenced in this case to 6 months hard labour for the offence of brandishing revolvers and taking the girl. very typically, and again, might be interesting, Jarlath, from your perspective as a GP, the girl fainted and was unconscious when they took her out. And so this, I suppose, indicates often these episodes were very traumatic, and they are sort of metaphors for literally, I suppose, the trauma that was inflicted. They cut her hair off with shears, the 4 men, and they said to her sister, quote unquote, "That is what she got for going with Tommies." So any kind of, I suppose, sexual association with the other side or any intimation of sharing information was generally, this punishment was meted out to stop it, to control it. And again, the report goes on, when one of the men was cutting her hair, he sang, "We are out for Ireland free." Mr. Golding, CS, said in the court that it was a blackguardly action. He said, having attempted to free Ireland by cutting off the girl's hair to complete the freedom of Ireland, they proposed to cut off her ears, but they didn't do so. Dr. Thompson from Tuam said the girl was suffering from shock and was still under her care. So we see a lot of evidence coming through of the way in which women, I suppose, got caught between the conflict as it evolved. Republican women, I suppose, punished through hair cutting, which was this, I suppose, a stigmatized thing to happen to a woman, to have her hair forcibly removed, and often violence involved with that. And then on the other hand, women, I suppose, who were exercising freedom in their sexuality were likewise policed, or if they were suspected of carrying information. Of course, the punishment for this could be more severe, as we know, and we do know of other kinds of assaults. Again, just briefly, John, there's one more example, which I'll just turn to, from the perspective, Caroline Townsend, the court Gaelic leaguer, in Charles Townsend's book, she's quoted, and she said, in November 1920, Lady Gregory heard from her doctor in Galway, the family of the girls violated by the Black and Tans wish it to be hushed up. And another case of the same sort in Clare was also to be kept quiet. So there's many more examples. There are just a few I picked out in terms of, the Tuam area and Galway, but I think that term hushed up, to be kept quiet, perhaps suggests that there's an awful lot more to be looked at in terms of the War of Independence, its impact on women, which perhaps has, I suppose, haven't been given the same attention, and that all of the, I suppose, individuals we're talking about here were implicated and wrapped up in that type of conflict that was occurring.
Yeah, thanks very much. Very interesting examples, Linda, of and indeed some of this material is covered in your in the new book, which we mentioned. The comments are coming thick and fast at this stage. Marion Kennedy is wondering about the connection with what is now the O'Donoghue Centre, the university's O'Donoghue Centre. I suppose I can take that one myself briefly. What is now the O'Donoghue Centre was then an industrial building, not part of the university campus. It had been a jute factory from the 1860s. It was a bonded warehouse for Perce's distillery subsequent to that. During the First World War, it was a shell factory. And then during this period in the aftermath, it was occupied by the 17th Lancers, a British Army regiment. So as Damian pointed out, there were also some Black and Tans stationed there. I won't go on anymore, but certainly it's an important site in Galway history in several respects. Somebody, Stefan de Londres of Thawley, asks Damian that if he thinks that the suggestion that Michael Moran was trying to escape was nonsense. So yeah, maybe Damian might.
Hi, Stefan. Excellent question. Yeah, I think as we examine closely now the documents that are available, and we know them to be 100% true, we're going to see the auxiliary side of the question, yeah, he ran, she ran. I mean, in relation to Mr. Moran, he didn't run in Tuam and he knew they were coming for him. Why would he run in Galway? I mean, these guys were incredible. He was 29 or something. Yeah, no, I don't think he ran. We saw from the medical report, now there's a little bit of confusion about this. It says he was shot in the temple. And perhaps, Jarlath, if I could maybe ask you a question, if you don't mind, John, it's just something I've been thinking about. Are you in there, John? Hi, Jarlath.
Yeah.
It says there was, you know yourself, you've read the statements from the auxiliaries. They're most of the time a work of fiction. If you were shot in the temple, how long do you reckon it would take for someone to die?
A matter of straight away, a couple of minutes.
So, this whole idea of a fella lying, of Michael Moran lying there dying, and ambulance is being called, is all complete poppycock. Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt.
It's straight into the brain, job done. Unfortunately. Yeah.
So, do you want to elaborate a little bit, Jarlath, on those reports?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, the reports, of course, the auxiliary stated that he was shot while trying to escape. And I mean, if somebody's trying to escape, the most likely place you'll hit them is in the back with a shot. A man who's shot in the left temple, you know, you expect that he's shot at close range from the front or side. So, you know, really, there's no doubt to anybody, it's a summary execution, and there's no other way to explain it. So he would have died practically straight away from the shooting. There was a delay by the time he got into the hospital, and the auxiliaries stated that they brought him to the hospital, which was only minutes away. But the medical officer from one of the reports stated that he had died some hours before he arrived at the hospital. So there's no doubt that he was left there before he was finally brought to the hospital.
Yeah. Thanks for that. That answers. We might get to some of the other questions as well. I just want to go back to Síobhra. I know that Síobhra has some interest, having published the Ernie O'Malley material and so on, that you have an interest in autobiographical treatments of the period by veterans, and also in some of the literary treatments. We can't give you the half hour you'd need to answer this question, Síobhra, but perhaps you might comment briefly on the way that this was remembered retrospectively, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely, John. What I'll just say is, I suppose my main PhD research is the study of testimonies from the Irish Civil War, and I'm really interested in the fact that a lot of veterans adapted, I suppose, unconventional or narrative forms, whether that was autobiographical fiction, as a means, I suppose, to insert these experiences into the public domain because of the taboo surrounding the Civil War. So it's a really interesting aspect of this, which hasn't been unpacked, I don't think, up till now. But I'll just reflect actually on the Galway case, because I think this just shows that there was such an interaction, I suppose, between these events and the literary imagination. So if we look at the Eileen Quinn death, her death was actually referred to in a poem by W.B. Yeats, and I'll just read out the 4 lines, the stanza, and I think that's a really interesting example of how these events were then remembered, and I suppose they lived on in these literary afterlives. So there's four lines here from a poem by W.B. Yeats. Now days are dragon ridden, the nightmare rides upon sleep, a drunken soldierly can leave the mother murdered at her door to crawl in her own blood to go scot-free. So I think incredibly powerful lines, but there's actually an insinuation there that Scott was the surname of one of the leading auxiliaries at this time. And there's a suggestion that maybe Yeats was pointing the finger at somebody for her death in that. But in my opinion anyway, this Yeats poem isn't the only example of I suppose, a literary afterlife of Eileen Quinn. The Cunningham novelist Annie P. Smithson also has a novel by Shadowed Way that was published in 1942. And the whole novel recounts the experiences of a daughter who was present when her mother was shot by a raiding group of black and tans when they were standing outside the front of our house. And I can't imagine how the story of Eileen Quinn did not in some way influence this novel, as it would have been widely reported. And not only that, one of the fascinating things when I was preparing for this this evening was I listened to that fascinating podcast, but there's a reference to the implications of Eileen's death on her children, and how one of the daughters in particular was very affected, that she had come across her mother, and that she was entered into a convent and cared for by the nuns. Annie P. Smithson's entire novel then is about the experience of a woman who ends up being somewhat institutionalized and in a convent in the same situation, having witnessed her mother's death at the front of the house. So I think that these sources are just fascinating to unpack in terms of how authors try to continue these legacies and these memories. And obviously that is a fictional account, but there definitely is some kind of influence there between Eileen Quinn and Annie P. Smithson's novel.
Thanks, Síobhra, for that. We have a few more comments. They're coming thick and fast at this stage from Jerry Handley. And I'll just read it. It is remarkable that I studied at the Enge block beside the ball alley for 4 years. At national school, I did a project on the old Eglinton barracks and visited the cells, and never a mention of these events in our history class or local lore. Question: why were people so quiet about these events in the 50s and 60s? And I think perhaps some of that was answered maybe already in some of what Damian suggested. Michael O'Connell wants to know how the university responded to the events of the time and the killing of Michael Moran. I suppose I'm not aware of any official response to the killing of Michael Moran from the university at that time. I did say at the outset that there were that students were involved in various ways, in volunteers and coming on, and indeed in the electoral activity. Luke Callanan mentions the history of the internment camp at the Galway Town Hall, which he says is not widely known and seems to be unexplored. Two volunteers, Michael Mullins from Mount Bellew and Patrick Walsh from Hollymount in over the border in County Mayo, were died while incarcerated there a few months after the events we're talking about this evening. Right. So we're kind of coming up against our hour. We have some more minutes to time for a few more observations or reflections, and time indeed to answer any further questions. I suppose just to get back to Michael Moran, for it was he that brought us all together this evening. If I can go back to Jarlath, maybe to talk about the memory and I suppose commemoration of Michael Moran, who, as you've established, was quite a significant figure in the Tuam area, Barnajarrag area, in the period between 1917 and his death, certainly.
Yeah, that's right, John. Just in relation to Michael Moran's funeral, it has to be stated that Michael Moran's funeral was one of the largest seen in Tuam at the time. When the hearse on the Friday evening after he was killed approached the town, the coffin was removed and carried shoulder high by relays of volunteers through the town. It was draped with the tricolour, as you'd expect. The town came to a standstill on that Friday evening as the coffin was carried through the town. People lined the streets silently and businesses closed. Now, the immediate reaction, as Damian has alluded to, in the town was one of shock and outrage, to everybody. There was no doubt whatsoever that this was a summary execution. Even the traditionally conservative and cautious clergy were also shocked. And Archbishop Gilmartin of Tuam, who was somebody who had argued for a truce of God for months shortly after this time, he refuted the verdict off the military court. And he reminded the congregation that Michael Moran had not been found guilty of any crime. And he laid the responsibility for his death firmly at the feet of the British government. Following the funeral mass on Saturday morning, there was a tremendous amount of tension in the town, because a large number of British soldiers gathered at the exit from the cathedral with fixed bayonets, and they were determined to prevent the IRA from having a military funeral, a military send-off for Michael Moran. About 200 volunteers, unarmed volunteers, attended the funeral and wanted to parade in military formation, but the army, the soldiers, went in through the congregation as it walked behind the coffin and pushed the men to the sides, to the paths on the side, and separated the initial family from the rest of the crowd until they reached the gates of the graveyard. Michael Moran was laid to rest in the same plot as his father, who died 5 years earlier. In relation to his immortalization, certainly in the immediate period after he died, he was immortalized as a martyr. And there was a piece in the Tuam Herald the week after he died, which I'm going to read. It's very short, and it simply states, everyone who knew Michael Moran mourns for him and his untimely end. And those of us who remain behind have the consolation of knowing that his name will be inscribed among the hero martyrs who gave their all that Ireland might live. That statement was followed a month later by a poem published in the same newspaper consisting of 15 verses, which was a memoriam to the late Michael Moran, which eulogized him. And again, just over a year and a half later, when Eamon de Valera was in Tuam to speak at an anti-treaty rally, he made the point before leaving Tuam to call and pay his respects at the grave of Michael Moran. But since that time, unfortunately, Michael Moran's contribution has been largely forgotten. Apart from a local common of a political party named in his honour, there's no other organisation, no GA club, or no street that's called after him. And I think one of the reasons for that is perhaps because his subsequent events have perhaps overshadowed Michael Moran's contribution. And in particular, I think of the execution of 6 Republican prisoners in Tuam towards the end of the Civil War in 1923. These 6 men were executed in the old workhouse, and the oratory wall where they were shot still remains, and there's a memorial plaque there. So that wall has become, if you like, the focus of Republican commemoration today, rather than the grave of Michael Moran. But hopefully events like this and others will rekindle interest and preserve his memory.
Thanks very much for that, Jarlath. And I suppose in the Galway context, the episode has been somewhat overshadowed, likewise, by other awful events that happened in the same month, including the killing of Father Griffin. Wait till we see. There's questions. Interestingly, the questioners are being answered by other people on the chat. I think we're quite coming right up to time now. So unless there's anything else that any of the panelists want to say, any contribution or any question or comment they want to make. Nobody wants to add anything else? Linda?
Just to say, to mention your own new chapter, John and Sarah Ann Buckley, on the Tuam martyrs, that you've just published a new chapter on this topic, so which you're too modest to say.
Indeed, it's one of the chapters in Linda's new book that we referred to earlier, which is, I suppose, about the building itself, the Tuam workhouse, and the subsequent its use during the War of Independence, and indeed its subsequent use as a mother and baby home. Which is all connected with the history of the period. Thanks for that, Linda. Any of the other panelists have anything interesting to say? Right.
Just before you go, I just saw a question there. Somebody asked, did any of the Connacht Rangers who joined the Black and Tans survive the war? I'm presuming she's talking about the War of Independence. And yes, most of the military ex-servicemen, not just Connacht Rangers, but Dublin Fusiliers, Munster Fusiliers, and the Enniskillen Fusiliers, who had all served for a long service in the British Army and the Boer War and World War I, who freely joined up as Black and Tans. The vast majority of them survived because they were extremely well-trained soldiers.
Thank you.
My last word on that. Sorry, just wanted to answer that.
Thanks, Damian. And of course, as Connacht Rangers, they had survived the conflict of the previous few years as well. So I'm going to, we've gone over time slightly. I'd just like to thank all the panelists for a very interesting and wide-ranging discussion, and the compliments are coming in here on the chat at the side. Just to mention before before we do wrap it up, that this will all be available on the Moore Institute's YouTube channel in the next few days. It's on Facebook, so it was streamed on Facebook, so it should be available for anybody who wants to hear it on that medium as well. So to Damian, to Jarlath, to Síobhra, to Linda, and indeed to the Moore Institute, thank you very much and good night.